The red warning lights flashed across the massive council chambers on Centauri Prime as an urgent transmission broke through their regular meeting. The sound was sharp and desperate, cutting through the usual diplomatic chatter like a knife through silk. Every 30 seconds, the same terrifying message played on repeat, echoing off the crystalline walls where representatives from dozens of alien worlds had gathered. Emergency beacon activated. Colony under hostile attack. Repeat, colony under hostile attack. Requesting immediate assistance. Ambassador Veltar, a tall figure with blue-tinted skin representing the Altarian Republic, felt his 3 hearts skip a beat as he watched the tactical display update with incoming data. The holographic screen showed a sight that made even the most experienced military minds in the room go silent. Dozens of red dots swarmed around a small green dot that represented mining colony Delta 7 on the distant world of Kepler 442c. 47 vessels of unknown origin have entered the system, Veltar announced, his voice carrying across the chamber's advanced sound system. They've completely destroyed the colony's orbital defense platforms. The attackers came out of nowhere and hit them hard. The chamber filled with worried murmurs as representatives processed this information. Many had friends, family, or business partners working at the mining colonies scattered across the galaxy's outer rim. These colonies were the backbone of galactic civilization, providing rare minerals and resources that kept their advanced technology running. Counselor Thex, floating on her personal gravity platform above the main floor, added the detail that made everyone's blood run cold. 12,000 civilians are trapped down there. It's a mixed species population with families, children, elderly residents. This isn't a military base or research station. These are innocent people trying to make a living. The moment those words left her mouth, the chamber exploded into chaos. Representatives jumped to their feet, shouting in dozens of different languages. Some demanded immediate military action, while others urged caution. The air filled with clicking, chirping, and growling sounds as different species expressed their outrage in their native tongues. But there was one critical detail that made this situation far more complicated than a typical rescue mission. Delta 7 wasn't just any colony. It sat deep within what the Galactic Council had designated as the Quarantine Zone, a massive region of space that had been declared off-limits to all Council ships and personnel 50 years ago. This wasn't empty space or some mysterious alien territory. This was Deathworlder space, home to humans and other species that the Council considered too dangerous and unpredictable to deal with directly. These weren't evil beings, but they were so aggressive and reckless that every attempt at normal diplomatic relations had ended in disaster. The Council had learned this lesson the hard way. 50 years earlier, they had sent 3 massive fleets into human territory to establish formal relations. Those fleets had never returned. Not destroyed in battle, but simply vanished without a trace. Some said the humans had captured them. Others believed they had been converted to the human cause. A few whispered that they had been scared away by witnessing what humans were truly capable of when pushed to their limits. High Admiral Zephan, the Council's top military commander, stood up slowly. His reptilian features showed no emotion as he delivered his verdict. Standard protocol is absolutely clear in this situation. We log the incident as an acceptable loss and move on to other business. We cannot risk Council lives or resources in Deathworlder space. The word acceptable hit Ambassador Veltar like a physical blow. He shot to his feet, his blue skin darkening with anger. Acceptable? Did you just call the deaths of 12,000 innocent people acceptable? There are Altarian children down there. Families who trusted the Council to protect them. Zephan's cold eyes fixed on Veltar without showing even a hint of sympathy. Those are children whose families chose to live in Deathworlder space despite all warnings. The risks were clearly explained to everyone who settled in that region. They knew what they were getting into when they decided to live next to the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Other representatives joined the argument. Some supported Zephan's position, arguing that the Council couldn't risk starting a war with the humans over one colony. Others sided with Veltar, insisting that abandoning civilians went against everything the Council stood for. As the debate grew more heated, nobody noticed that the emergency beacon was broadcasting on an open frequency. The desperate plea for help wasn't just reaching the council chambers on Centauri Prime. It was spreading across subspace, bouncing off communication relays and growing stronger with each transmission. In the dark void of space, monitoring stations picked up the signal. Automated systems recorded the message and forwarded it along established communication networks. And somewhere in the forbidden depths of Deathworlder space, ears that the council never intended to reach were beginning to listen. The humans had heard the call for help, and they were already making their own plans. The hot coffee splashed across Captain Jake Miller's desk as the emergency alarm suddenly screamed through the bridge of the Terran Defense Force ship Relentless. The sound was unlike anything they used for routine drills or minor alerts. This was the real deal, the kind of alarm that meant people were dying somewhere in the galaxy and time was running out fast. Miller wiped the coffee from his hands and immediately focused on the chaos erupting around him. The bridge crew was moving with practiced efficiency, but he could see the tension in their faces. After 20 years of military service, he knew the difference between a training exercise and a genuine crisis. The human monitoring station on Outpost 7 had been quietly listening to Galactic Council communications for the past 6 hours. While the Council thought they were having private debates about acceptable losses and strategic priorities, human intelligence officers were recording every word, analyzing every decision, and preparing detailed reports on what was really happening out there in the darkness of space. Lieutenant Amy Foster, a young woman with sharp eyes and faster fingers than anyone else on the ship, was already pulling up data streams on the holographic display that dominated the center of the bridge. Her hands moved across the controls like she was playing some kind of deadly musical instrument, pulling together information from dozens of sources into one clear picture. "Sir, I've got the complete tactical breakdown of the situation," she reported, her voice steady despite the urgency of the moment. "Unknown raiders hit mining colony Delta 7 approximately 6 hours ago. They came in fast and hit hard, completely overwhelming the colony's defensive systems before anyone could mount an effective resistance." Miller felt his jaw muscles tighten as he read through the scrolling data on his personal screen. The numbers were worse than he had initially feared. This wasn't just an attack on a small outpost or research station. This was a full-scale assault on a major civilian population center. 12,000 people trapped down there, he said, more to himself than to anyone else on the bridge. Foster nodded grimly as she pulled up more detailed information. "That includes approximately 2,000 humans, sir. Most of them are miners and their families who've been working the asteroid fields in that sector for the past decade. These aren't soldiers or mercenaries. They're ordinary people trying to make a living in one of the most dangerous regions of space." Before Miller could respond, the main communication screen flickered to life, showing the weathered face of Admiral Tom Bradley. Bradley was a legend in the Terran Defense Force, a man who had spent 40 years fighting in every major conflict humanity had faced since they first ventured beyond their home solar system. His face bore the scars of battles that most people only read about in history books, and his eyes held the kind of determination that had kept humanity alive when the rest of the galaxy tried to wipe them out. "This is Phoenix Command to all ships in the Third Fleet," Bradley announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We have a situation developing in Sector 7 that requires immediate intervention. While the Galactic Council sits in their comfortable chambers debating acceptable losses and strategic considerations, real people are dying out there. Families are being slaughtered by raiders while politicians argue about protocol and risk assessment." The Admiral paused for a moment, letting his words sink in across the 12 ships that made up the Third Fleet. Each vessel was packed with soldiers, marines, pilots, and support staff who had volunteered to serve in the most dangerous military force in known space. These weren't conscripts or reluctant draftees. These were professionals who had chosen to stand between humanity and everything that wanted to destroy them. "The Third Fleet is moving to provide immediate assistance to the civilians trapped at Delta 7, Bradley continued. "This is not a request or a suggestion. This is a direct order from Terran High Command. We're going in." Just as the Admiral finished speaking, Foster held up her hand to get Miller's attention. Her face had gone pale as she monitored incoming transmissions from Council space. "Sir, the Council is transmitting a direct warning to all human forces in the region. They're ordering us to maintain our distance from the quarantine zone and not to interfere with their decision-making process." Miller read the official Council message as it scrolled across his screen. The language was typical diplomatic doublespeak, full of legal terminology and veiled threats about the consequences of unauthorized military action in restricted space. The basic message was clear enough though: stay out of our business, or face the consequences. A grim smile spread across Miller's face as he finished reading the Council's warning. After 50 years of being treated like dangerous outcasts, after decades of being blamed for every conflict and crisis in the galaxy, the Council still expected humans to follow their rules and respect their authority. "Send a reply to the Council, Lieutenant," Miller said, his voice carrying a tone that his crew knew meant business. "Tell them, message received and understood. Proceeding with rescue mission anyway." Within minutes of that transmission, 12 human warships broke formation and began accelerating toward a region of space that had been declared completely off-limits to all civilized species. Behind them, automated Council monitoring stations tracked their movement with sensors that had been programmed to record any violations of the quarantine zone. The readings those stations sent back to Council headquarters were met with a mixture of horror and fascination. Once again, the unpredictable humans were doing exactly what everyone expected them never to do. They were heading straight into hell to save people who had been written off as acceptable losses. The Third Fleet sliced through space like a pack of hunting wolves returning to territory they knew better than anyone else in the galaxy. This region, which the Galactic Council had labeled as the Deadlands and marked as completely off-limits to civilized travel, was simply home to the humans who lived and fought here every single day. What looked like certain death to other species was just another day at the office for Terran Defense Force crews. The massive asteroid fields that could tear apart the sophisticated Council vessels with their delicate hull plating and complex systems became perfect cover for the human ships. These weren't obstacles to avoid, but tools to use in ways that would seem completely insane to any other military force in the galaxy. The radiation storms that regularly swept through this sector would scramble the advanced electronic systems that Council ships depended on for everything from navigation to life support. Their computers would crash, their sensors would go blind, and their crews would be left helpless in the darkness of space. But the humans had learned long ago not to trust their lives to fancy technology that could fail at the worst possible moment. Terran systems were built tough and simple, designed by engineers who knew that complexity was a luxury you couldn't afford when your life was on the line. The same radiation that would cripple an alien warship barely made the human equipment flicker. Their hardened electronics kept working, their backup systems kicked in automatically, and their crews knew how to fly and fight even when all the computers went dead. Commander Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the Dauntless, studying the tactical display that showed the true scope of what they were facing. After 20 years of military service, she had learned to read between the lines of intelligence reports and sensor data to understand what was really happening in any combat situation. "I'm confirming 30 raider vessels in the target system," she reported to the rest of the fleet over the secure communication channel. "But here's the problem, they're not fighting like typical pirates or raiders. These guys are smart, and they're using the civilians as human shields by clustering them around their ships." This was the kind of tactical situation that would stop most military forces dead in their tracks. Standard Galactic Council doctrine was built around the idea of minimizing civilian casualties at all costs, even if it meant letting the enemy escape or sacrificing military objectives. It was a noble approach that worked well when fighting other civilized species who followed similar rules of engagement. Captain Jake Miller's voice crackled through the communication system from his position aboard the Relentless. "That's actually pretty smart thinking on their part. They know that Standard Council doctrine would never risk civilian casualties in a direct assault. Any normal rescue fleet would have to pull back and call for reinforcements or try to negotiate." From his position on the bridge of the Vigilant, Captain Bill Thompson let out a low chuckle that his crew had learned meant trouble for somebody. "Good thing we're not following Council doctrine then. Good thing we're not the Council at all." The 12 ships of the Third Fleet began to spread out as they approached the Kepler 442c system, each vessel taking a completely different route through the maze of debris fields, radiation clouds, and gravitational anomalies that surrounded the besieged mining colony. To outside observers, it would look like the human fleet was falling apart, losing cohesion and discipline as they got closer to their target. But the humans knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't chaos or confusion. This was a carefully coordinated attack plan that took advantage of every piece of cover and every environmental hazard in the system. Each ship was following a precise course that had been calculated to bring them into position for a simultaneous strike from multiple directions. The scanner readings that came back from the colony itself painted a grim picture of what the raiders had accomplished in the hours since their initial attack. The survivors had been herded together into the colony's main habitat domes, the heavily reinforced structures that provided life support and protection from the harsh environment of the planet's surface. Under normal circumstances, those domes would be the safest place for civilians during an attack. But the raiders had turned them into perfect prison camps, with thousands of innocent people packed together in spaces that could be easily monitored and controlled. Any attempt at a direct assault would almost certainly result in massive civilian casualties as the raiders used their hostages as shields. Miller studied the tactical situation for several long minutes before making his decision. The kind of frontal assault that other military forces would attempt was completely out of the question. The risks were too high, the chances of success too low, and the potential for civilian casualties too great. Conventional attack strategies are not going to work here, he announced to the entire fleet. The raiders have positioned themselves perfectly to counter any standard military response. But they've made one critical mistake in their planning. He paused for a moment, letting the suspense build as his crews waited to hear what their commander had in mind. They're expecting to fight against civilized soldiers who follow civilized rules of warfare. Time to show them exactly why the rest of the galaxy fears Deathworlders. Commander Hayes felt a familiar smile cross her face as she began plotting an intercept course that would take the Dauntless directly through a radiation field so intense that it would kill most alien species within minutes of exposure. The route she was planning would be considered attempted suicide by any other military force in the galaxy. "Roger that, Captain," she replied, her voice steady and confident. Going dark in 30 seconds. All across the Third Fleet, human crews began shutting down non-essential systems and preparing for the kind of attack that would become legend in the years to come. The 12 ships of the Third Fleet suddenly disappeared like smoke in a strong wind, each vessel vanishing into the swirling chaos of space debris, radiation clouds, and electromagnetic storms that surrounded the Delta 7 mining colony. To anyone watching from a distance, it would seem like the human fleet had simply dissolved into nothing, leaving behind only empty space and the occasional flicker of energy that could have been anything. But the humans were still there, moving through the cosmic battlefield like ghosts that knew every shadow and hiding place. They had shut down their life support systems, turning off the heating, air recycling, and artificial gravity that kept their ships livable. The crew compartments became freezing cold tombs where human soldiers breathed from emergency oxygen tanks and moved in the weightless darkness like they had been born to it. Power was cut to everything except the most basic navigation and communication systems. The bright lights that normally illuminated the corridors went dark. The computer screens that usually displayed tactical information and sensor readings went blank. The automated systems that most species depended on for survival were deliberately turned off, leaving the humans to rely on their own eyes, ears, and instincts. These weren't desperate measures taken by a fleet in trouble. This was a calculated strategy that turned the human ships into invisible predators moving through an environment that would kill most other species within minutes. While the raiders scanned space looking for the bright energy signatures of conventional warships, the human vessels drifted closer like hunting sharks moving through dark water. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez crawled through a maintenance shaft so narrow that his shoulders scraped against the metal walls with every movement forward. Behind him, 8 of the toughest Marines in the Terran Defense Force followed in single file, their combat armor modified to fit through spaces that were never designed for human occupation. Their weapons were strapped to their backs, their breathing was controlled and silent, and their movements were guided by years of training in zero-gravity combat. "Remember what we're dealing with here," Rodriguez whispered to his team over the short-range communication system built into their helmets. "These raiders aren't council soldiers with formal training in standard equipment. They've never had to fight against boarding parties in zero-gravity conditions. Most of them have probably never even seen real combat beyond shooting at defenseless civilians." The maintenance shaft led directly into the heart of the enemy vessel, bypassing all the security measures and defensive systems that were designed to stop conventional attacks. While the raider crew focused their attention on scanning space for approaching ships, they never considered the possibility that their enemies might already be inside their own vessel, moving through the hidden spaces between the walls. The raiders never knew what hit them. While their bridge crew debated whether the strange blips on their sensors were equipment malfunctions or space debris, human marines were already cutting through hull plating with plasma torches and pouring into their ships like a flood of armed shadows that seemed to appear from nowhere. On the raider flagship, complete chaos erupted in a matter of minutes. Lieutenant Kate Wilson led her assault team through the ship's corridors like she had studied the blueprints for years, even though she was seeing the interior layout for the first time. Her team moved with the fluid coordination of soldiers who had trained together through countless battles, covering each other's movements and communicating with hand signals that worked even when their communication systems were jammed. The bridge of the enemy flagship fell in under 4 minutes. The alien crew, caught completely off guard by attackers who seemed to materialize out of thin air, never had a chance to mount an effective defense or call for help from their fellow raiders. "We've got complete control of their command ship," Wilson reported, her voice steady and professional despite the fact that she was floating in zero gravity surrounded by the bodies of enemy soldiers. "All command and control systems are under our control." Captain Miller's response came through the communication channel as he led his own boarding party through the corridors of another raider vessel. "Excellent work, Kate. We've secured the engine room and weapons systems on target 2. How are the civilians?" Meanwhile, Captain Bill Thompson's voice crackled through the fleet communication system from deep inside the engine compartment of a third enemy ship. "I've got 3 ships completely neutralized and we're converting their life support systems to provide breathable atmosphere for our people. These alien vessels definitely weren't built for real combat situations. Their security is a joke and their crew quarters are designed for comfort, not defense." The raiders, who had spent years terrorizing helpless mining colonies and merchant convoys, suddenly found themselves fighting against an enemy that defied everything they thought they knew about space combat. These human soldiers seemed to appear out of nowhere, move through impossible spaces, and thrive in conditions that should have killed them instantly. The alien crews had always followed a simple strategy: hit fast, grab what they could, and run away before any real military force could respond. They were used to dealing with frightened civilians and lightly armed security guards, not professional soldiers who treated vacuum exposure and zero gravity like a natural environment. As ship after ship fell to the human boarding parties, the remaining raiders began to realize they weren't fighting a conventional rescue mission. They were facing something far more dangerous than anything they had ever encountered in their careers as space pirates and raiders. They were fighting Deathworlders who had turned their own reputation as the galaxy's most feared warriors into the ultimate weapon. 18 hours after the first human warship had crossed into the forbidden quarantine zone, the final raider vessel surrendered to boarding parties who seemed to appear out of thin air and fight like beings possessed. What had started as a desperate rescue mission had turned into a masterclass in unconventional warfare that would be studied by military academies across the galaxy for generations to come. The silence that followed the last gunshot was almost deafening after hours of intense combat, explosions, and the constant chatter of tactical communications. Now, emergency medical teams worked side by side with human engineers to restore power, atmosphere, and basic life support systems to the colony's damaged habitat domes that had been turned into prison camps by the raiders. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Rachel Price stood in the main medical bay of the Relentless, reviewing casualty reports on her tablet while exhausted medics continued treating patients from more than a dozen different alien species. Her uniform was stained with various colors of alien blood, her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but her voice remained steady and professional as she delivered the final numbers that everyone had been waiting to hear. "Final casualty count is in," she reported to Captain Miller and the other fleet commanders. 11,800 survivors recovered from the colony. We lost some people during the initial attack and the early hours of captivity, but considering what these raiders were capable of, the numbers could have been so much worse. Miller stood at the observation deck of his ship, watching something that filled his heart with a mixture of pride and sadness. The evacuation ships were loading up with refugees from species that had spent the last 50 years treating humans like dangerous animals that needed to be locked away from civilized society. Now those same aliens were clutching human medics who had worked through the night without rest, sharing their food rations, and giving their own blankets to keep alien children warm. Altarian youngsters with their distinctive blue skin and large eyes held tightly to the hands of human doctors who had spent 20 straight hours performing surgery on wounded civilians. These were the same Altarians whose government representatives had voted to abandon the colony rather than risk contact with the dangerous Deathworlders. Centaurian engineers, known throughout the galaxy for their advanced technical knowledge and sophisticated equipment, were learning basic repair techniques from human technicians who seemed capable of fixing absolutely anything with nothing more than spare parts, determination, and a willingness to get their hands dirty. The humans worked with tools that other species would consider primitive, but somehow managed to restore complex life support systems that alien experts had declared beyond repair. The communication system crackled to life as Admiral Tom Bradley's voice reached every ship in the Third Fleet simultaneously. His transmission carried the weight of authority and the satisfaction of a job well done against impossible odds. Phoenix command to all vessels of the Third Fleet. Outstanding work out there. You've just accomplished something that will be remembered long after we're all gone. Escort the civilian refugees safely back to Council space and then stand by for new orders. Something tells me this won't be the last time the galaxy needs Deathworlders to clean up a mess that everyone else was too scared to handle. While the human fleet prepared for the long journey back to civilization, the political situation back on Centauri Prime had exploded into complete chaos. The council chambers that had been filled with calm diplomatic debate just hours earlier were now the scene of shouting matches, accusations, and demands for answers that nobody wanted to give. Representatives who had voted to abandon Delta 7 as an acceptable loss now faced furious constituents who wanted to know why their family members had been written off as expendable when the supposedly dangerous Deathworlders had managed to mount a successful rescue operation. The political fallout was spreading across dozens of worlds as news of the human rescue mission reached populations who had been told that their representatives were making the only reasonable decision possible. Ambassador Veltar found himself in the unusual position of defending the humans who had saved his people. He stood before the full council assembly, reading from reports that had been submitted by the rescued civilians themselves. These weren't military analysis or political spin, but first-hand accounts from ordinary people who had lived through the nightmare and been saved by soldiers they had been taught to fear. According to these testimonies, human soldiers shared their personal food rations with alien civilians who were starving, Veltar read, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. Human medical personnel worked 20-hour shifts without rest to save the lives of wounded aliens. Human engineers rebuilt critical infrastructure with their bare hands, using nothing but scrap metal and pure determination. The reports continued for hours, painting a picture of human behavior that contradicted 50 years of official council policy. These weren't the bloodthirsty monsters that lived in the quarantine zone. These were people who risked their lives to save strangers from species that had treated them as outcasts and criminals. That evening, a classified message reached Admiral Bradley through secure council military communication channels. The transmission was brief, direct, and represented a complete reversal of decades of official policy toward human military capabilities. Formal request for consultation on Deathworlder combat applications and tactical doctrine. Previous assumptions about human military limitations require immediate reassessment. Request earliest possible meeting to discuss potential cooperation agreements. Signed, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Galactic Council Defense Force. Captain Miller stood alone on the bridge of the Relentless, watching the stars whirl past as they headed back toward human space. The rescued civilians were safe, the raiders had been eliminated, and the immediate crisis was over. But he knew that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. For 50 years, Humans had been the dangerous outcasts living beyond the quarantine zone, too violent and unpredictable for civilized society to tolerate. They had been blamed for every conflict, excluded from every alliance, and treated like wild animals that needed to be contained for everyone's safety. Now, suddenly, they were something else entirely. They were the ones you called when the impossible needed to be done. They were the soldiers who went where others feared to travel, who fought battles that others declared unwinnable, and who saved people that others had written off as acceptable losses. The galaxy would never look at humanity quite the same way again. The Deathworlders had become something that the civilized species desperately needed, even if they didn't want to admit it yet. They had become hope.